Just to let you know what you're in for, this video was originally going to be me just talking about Abyssos. The fights, the style of delivery, the bits of dialogue, all the parts that like impressed me, and then I was going to end with some speculation at the end. But this shit is just too good, and I could not stop writing as I was sitting there. It was ultimately going to be about double the length this video is, until I realized I had to cut all of the non-speculation to make this at all reasonable. So first, let's talk about Greek myth and how FF14 is basically one big remix. The FF14 trend of, hey, there's a classical myth, let's see how we can play with it, will absolutely never get old if they just keep doing it like this. I mean, I'm biased being raised in a Christian country, but I still think their best example was Athena. She was very clearly playing the role of Lucifer, but obviously framed in a positive light, and so instead of, the devil thing. And I know people are in a little bit of disagreement over her Japanese name being Venus, because it's Venesu, not Venasu, because that's how they spell it, so it's spelled differently. And Venus obviously is Roman and not Greek, but I think the shoe generally fits. Anyway, for the stuff that's relevant to Pandemonium, in Greek myth, Athena sought out Hephaestus for one sole reason: to make use of his talents and his resources. She basically wanted him to make weapons for her own personal gain. But once they began to work together, Hephaestus was overcome by a one-sided desire, and in the process, this cursed child named Erichthonius was born. Not born to Athena, but born to the earth and Hephaestus in a way. He then went on to be a great king, but not without his share of suffering from, 1, an absentee father, and 2, a mother who wasn't actually there to take care of him. In the other versions of the myth, Hephaestus and Athena were happily married, and they were effectively two sides of the same coin. Both versions of this myth are being played with here really well, and of course the full Abyssos version of this story is extended and a little bit more nuanced, because it turns Athena into the villain, while Hephaestus was just a man who made some sacrifices. It's a super cute way of using myth as like a starting point in your writing, and especially one this strong with like the strong family drama, kind of remixing elements of it to kind of change the core points, change the core characters and the roles that each character kind of play. There are the same core ideas, of course, like Athena wanting Hephaestus for his skill and resources, they remain, as does Eric's birth being, let's call them grim circumstances, but it's a much different version that fits the number one FF14 tenet, and that is to make our villains the tragic heroes of their own story. The writers are on an absolute mission to right the wrongs with characters, and I think Lahabrea being a Saturday morning cartoon villain, or at least being called that, was probably like their most egregious. So they went, here's a dark Greek myth, and we'll adapt it, and it'll do 3 things. 1 is keep the entire theme of ancient society being Greek. 2, obviously get us to emotionally understand our villains' hardship, painting them in like the someone doing the wrong things for, at least from their perspective, like Hades, like Emmett, the right reasons. And 3, of course, is, as always, to further the depth of the world and the mechanics of the world, in this case, like the nature of ether and the nature of souls, which they've been doing in the MSQ as well, so I'll definitely have to come back to that in our speculation later on. But first, even like the small references are on point, and I thought they were interesting enough that I kind of wanted to highlight them before we got any further. Igemini, and yes, that's the Greek pronunciation, is a name given to one of the 3 carites, or charities, I guess some know them as graces, and she was known for being a goddess of plants, which is, you've done the fight. We're getting hit by those annoying parasite plant things, and interestingly, Aglaia was also a name given to the carites. That might be a coincidence, or, given some things, it might be the plot thickening. Our next boss then, Abyssos, was a child of Zeus known for being a hermaphrodite. That got really weird, as is usual for Greek myth, of course. It included multiple castrations, one of which resulted in an almond tree growing, which later then made a lady pregnant. But the point was, Abyssos was uncontrollable and rebellious, and because of her hermaphroditic nature, this made the gods afraid. This stuff is clearly represented in the boss being a tree, and then the Bow of Attis attack is specifically referring to Attis, who was the son born of the aforementioned lady and almond tree, and unfortunately, uncomfortably, a target of Abyssos' affection, despite her technically being his mother. And ultimately, Attis was another victim of castration. I did say I got pretty weird. But I think the more tame reference to her wild nature is how she was so willing to spill the beans in Lahabrea and Athena. You kind of had that this conversation's a bit uncomfortable, but she's like, yeah, I'll just say whatever. Yeah, this shit happened. This is real. And I thought that was like a really nice touch of her being wild and uncontrollable. So far, even their general dealing with like solid human concepts shine through. Obviously, Hephaestus is dealing with the idea of the shadow. The part of himself, Hephaestus, Lahabrea, the part of himself he's ashamed of and refuses to accept. But if this were to follow through like classical storytelling, he would eventually have to face it in order to move forward. In a video that feels like an age ago now, I went into depth on the Asphodelos themes, the ones borrowed from myth, and quite a few of them have been clearly discarded, but there are two of them that remain, and they're the ones I'm going to use as the basis of my speculation. Anastasis and Apotheosis. Resurrection and Ascension. So now, just as we were wrapping things up in Pandemonium, I felt it was like, this is a great raid story. We've nicely resolved everything. The problem's gone. And then I asked in Discord, there are 3 tiers in a raid, right? Then, of course, not a minute after I said that, Claudian went missing, and then we had that utterly insane reveal at the end. And I should say, before I go any further here with speculation, Jesse Cox's theory crafting video is extremely good. He managed to pick up on a whole lot of smaller details that I hadn't noticed, and some of which I had kind of thought about and will be relying on here for my speculation, but it lined up with a whole bunch of other ideas and details. All this stuff just lines up. I'd recommend checking it out, but to begin, let's say I totally agree with his theory that Erichthonius is not a biological son, but an etheric one. Perhaps a soul formed of parts of their ether, or at least artificially forged to match theirs, or kind of something like that. The science they'll explain it, but I don't know what it is. Now, if I were obsessed with becoming God and creating souls, my first move would definitely be to make a failsafe in case I died or failed. So I imagine Claudian then is a shard of this Erichthonius, that's like Athena Hephaestus. The blue crystal is a trap of sorts. Athena will be reborn with a combination of Claudian, the crystal, and the remnants of Lahabrea that are, theoretically, still within Ascalon and Azysla. That sword clearly hits some aura sight-like capability. If you watch back the Heavensward stuff, you'll see that Thoran specifically uses it when he's absorbing Lahabrea, and specifically when he's absorbing the ether from the Warring Triad in the reactor. And then, like, if you're familiar with the concept of the Chekhov's gun in storytelling, it's basically if you show a gun, you're supposed to use it because it's important to the storytelling. If something's there, you use it later, you set it up. And that's exactly what happened with Ascalon, because it's a pretty important sword to Final Fantasy history and history in general, being the one that St. George used to kill the dragon. But the idea is that it didn't go away, right? It stayed there. It fell down, and then it was very visibly there was a whole camera shot of it falling, clattering on the ground. It didn't disappear when Nidhogg's eye was pulled from it, and then later on when Estinian Nidhogg flies away, it's very clearly there between its feet. So they definitely set it there for a reason. On top of that, it was manifested by King Thordan, but it hasn't disappeared, which means if that was born of ether, then there's clearly some ether still kind of giving it form. So I assume the ether that's still there, I mean, basically, theoretically, it gives the writers to say Lahabrea's ether is what's keeping that sword there. He was never returned to the Eternal Sea, the Ethereal Sea, but instead he's trapped there, which means he can be kind of break glass, bring him back, redeem him as a character, sorted. And I think they're going to do that. Now, is this going to cause some time travel bullshit because we're going back to the past? I don't think so. Logically following how they've been playing with time recently, Pandemonium being the Ethereal Sea heavily implies that we, in our efforts, have royally fucked something up. And I think that's a bit of a red herring, honestly. There are 2 major reasons for that, right? The first is, we've already messed with timelines enough. That's what we did for most of Endwalker. And the entire point of Hydaelyn was that. But they were super careful to ensure that whatever Hermes was doing was in a full memory wipe. So Hydaelyn, and obviously the writers, went to extreme effort to make sure we had a closed timeline. And the idea of them going, to hell with it, we'll mess with it again, that's honestly, it's bad juju, and it's like inviting disaster for storytelling. But at the least, I think there's nothing we can do that will change what's already happened in the past of our timeline, so our Lahabrea can't change. Everything that's happened is already a foregone conclusion. So the only thing that can happen is we do stuff and then we resolve it, so none of the past matters. Only what's going to happen in the future matters. At least that's what I'm fairly certain of, because I kind of trust these writers not to do dumb shit like open that can of worms completely again. The other thing then, of course, is actually kind of hard to explain. Most of it was me thinking about the mechanics of the ethereal sea and the two Greek themes that I talked about that I expect the story to follow on. But I think like looking these, the like mechanics of the world and stuff all make sense. Because there's Athena, there's the various bits of dialogue about Godhood, there's some of the major moments in P8S as well. To make a long story short, anastasis is resurrection. It's sometimes specifically used for Jesus' comeback tour, but the idea of resurrection and its ties to Godhood are constantly referenced throughout Pandemonium so far. There's Phoenix for a start, but then there's our Shadow Hephaestus who's seeking to resurrect his dead wife, which is a staple of cursed resurrection in, FF14 even so far, never mind myth. And then savage spoilers ahead. 3, 2, 1. Hephaestus kills us and then resurrects us in P8S. Now that's not technically canon, because P8S is usually a figment of Yoshi P's imagination or sometimes our own, but I think it's relevant. Especially because I said Shadow Hephaestus, right? Because Lahabrea literally calls Hephaestus his shadow, and then part of Carl Jung's theory for the shadow was that it was in direct opposition to the ego. And the attack that wipes the party is called Ego Death. Obviously, that's a cool name for an attack, no matter what, but I definitely don't think it's a coincidence. It basically can't be. The flavor text then for the resurrection is the concept of the phoenix, with an E, returns you from the brink of death, and then Hephaestus celebrates, yes, haha, at last! He nailed it. They nailed it. They actually know how to reform and restore a soul. The concept of resurrection was complete. The other thing then is that P8S's phase transition as well. So in Jesse Cox's video, he brings up these red and blue intertwining like helixes in the background. They match the color of Hephaestus' red crystal, and they also more or less match the color of the blank blue crystal. And also helix, data, stuff like that. But at the time, he hadn't seen footage of P8S because it wasn't out yet. Hephaestus says, Godhood is within my grasp. I need only reach. He breaks the chains that bind his physical form, and then he transforms into this. Yes, those are eyes everywhere, and those are in fact wings. It's a little bit Sephiroth, but it's also very biblically accurate angel kind of vibes. Then there's obviously the red mask that's crying blood, very creepy. And yes, the red and blue helix at the bottom. So you've got DNA, you've got red for Hephaestus, blue for Athena, you've got this concept of playing God and becoming God, and now you can see it's all coming together very nicely. Pandemonium anastasis. As for the other theme, it's a little less pervasive, but it's again kind of obvious. Apotheosis, effectively Greek for ascension, to become a god, to be deified. Athena and Shadow Hephaestus were obsessed with creating souls, creating life in a way, and every time we consider that in real life, here we call it playing God. It's a whole field of bioethics. Multiple times in dialogue, they claim their goal is to become as gods. And then Ehemetheos, which Hesperus became, is half god in Greek. But the first one we see is, Hesperus, and he was a Vrykolakas. And that's a being that Greeks believed came from those who lived a sacrilegious life. So he ended up stronger, but further from actual godhood when he started, through the meddling of Athena and Hephaestus. Nothing's a coincidence in this game, and I can tell you that. All of these themes tie together, and that's why it's so good when it clicks. Because it's all of these classical themes, all of these stories that have been told for thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years throughout mankind's history. And that's why I'm a fervent believer in genetic memory and soul memory and stuff, and I think that's why it resonates so hard with all of us. But to move on then, given that the ethereal sea is in the underworld, it would make sense that one who is seeking anastasis, resurrection, and apotheosis to become as god, they would take residence there, effectively in hell, because that's where all the souls are. If you're going to learn to bring them back, or you're going to learn to make them, that's where you're going to go. Or even if you just want ether to bolster your own soul, that's where you'll want to go. Because obviously underworld, kind of a little bit of hell vibes from Hades, but the idea is the original version of Hades, of the underworld, wasn't judgmental. It was just for all dead. There was no heaven or hell concept. It was just, this is where the dead go. And that's where you'd want to go. If you were God, that's where you would want to be, more or less. That's where God's usually said to be. And that's just thematically on point for what Athena and Hephaestus have been saying. Now, as for why it's in the Ethereal Sea, Pandemonium is in the Ethereal Sea in the present day, that's a bit weird. But I think Athena is being too well set up as this brilliant, genius villain, and one that's specifically not afraid of death, for her not to be the reason. I don't think it's time loop stuff. I don't think we started this process. I think it's to do with Hydaelyn no longer being there, and of course, what Claudian is doing, going to Abyssos. Clearly, Mommy was warding off all kinds of weird stuff, as evidenced by the 12 showing up out of the blue once she leaves. So clearly there's like some kind of defense system that's no longer functional, and that can make sense. But then for Athena, when she let Lahabrea kill her, she clearly trusts herself to resurrect herself. She clearly had the failsafe in Eric, the failsafe in Hephaestus. Clearly, in fact, it might have been her plan the whole damn time. To die, to wait all this time for this crystal to be the backup plan, the trap that brings Eric. Maybe she didn't account for the Sundering, maybe she didn't account for that. But Claude, or I guess Eric, to come to her rescue, combine them together, bring her back to life. And then there you go. She's kind of died so she would go to hell, so she could, or hell, the underworld, the Ethereal Sea, so she could resurrect there and be at the seat of everything. To me, that makes a lot more sense than us specifically messing up with time in the past. Because I imagine Athena's going to turn out to be a really, really good villain. All of this focus then on resurrection, as opposed to apotheosis and stuff, does make me think that the next raid will be called Pandemonium Anastasis. And if I were a betting man, I would put all of my formidable 6 million gil on it. Also, the eye in the sky, that might be Athena. So for my next thought, if you played Persona 4, congratulations, you've done all the background rating. It's the shadow thing, right? If they play this straight, the shadow version of Hephaestus, the events of the next tier will involve Hephaestus needing to do one of the hardest things a human can kind of theoretically do. Integrate his shadow. Face all the darkness, all the desire setup, all of that stuff from Athena, and then suppress or kill his own ego, his own ideals of saving the star. He has to kill all of that and integrate his shadow to basically become who he really actually is. His ideals of forcibly excising his emotion and his desire are cool and stoic and manly, but they're also clearly short-sighted and toxic. He has to face the Piper eventually, or maybe, they could give us a darker end and he's consumed by it, but importantly, we have to relate this back to our Lahabrea, the Realm Reborn one. And I think the half-sigil scene specifically is telling us that our Asian Lahabrea is the full version of the same dude. Which makes sense, because as long as he, the old daddy Lahabrea, and his shadow, the young unhinged one, both die and return to the Ethereal Sea after the Sundering, then those two parts of the soul would probably recombine in the sea. Probably, maybe. Or maybe Hades put them together because he saw the two parts and went, that's a bit weird, slap them together. But there are also theories about our enemy being Erechthonius, because he has Lahabrea's mask in his boss form, and then he wears the sigil of Matthias the Esper on the crystal thing, which is the FF2 Pandemonium ruler and the Esper sigil that makes up Lahabrea's sigil. Man, the Esper stuff is crazy. No, I think that's a possibility, but I don't think Hades would make the mistake of plucking Erechthonius out for Ascension and Asianhood instead of Lahabrea, unless Eric is actually a soul clone. But I think that's more. I think that's more a case of Erechthonius is like both. I don't think Hades would make that mistake, basically. And also it wouldn't work because if Claudian was the shard of Erechthonius, then that would imply Eric was sundered, which then he wouldn't be an unsundered Asian. So I think that's actually, it's a fun theory, but I definitely think they're trying to, like I said earlier, they're trying to redeem our Lahabrea. Not redeem literally, but they're trying to go, hey, this guy he was just a dude. He was a dude who, not to literally quote Homelander, but he's a dude who just fell in love with the wrong woman, and that went a wee bit wrong, as it so often does. At the end of the day, I think he was just a man led by his shadow, desperate to unsunder the world so he could get his beloved wife back. Sad. Sad. But then there's also the music, because of course the lyrics in the raid are obviously important now because that's the world we live in. In the last Panda video, I talked about how Hicks and Leonis was all about the dead rising. You know, the here be lions, don't come here, it's dangerous. The dark side of men, the darkness inside man, their true soul awakening, as the song says. So Scream then tells a similar story about the shadow. You know, say goodnight to the shadow I left far behind, assuming these lyrics are correct. To pandemonium, still bound to the flames that I bear. It's about Lahabrea and his relationship with, unfortunately, who he really is, which isn't really that bad, but a man who loves his wife and his son and is willing to do unreasonable things for them. It's hard to blame him, isn't it? That's why these writers are too strong. We can't even just hate the villains in our game. That said, based on what we know so far, maybe this will change. Athena can go fuck herself. So, there's your speculation. The next raid, speculation? No, it's fact. The next raid is called Anastasis, maybe Apotheosis. Our final boss will be a resurrected Athena, maybe a resurrected Athena Hephaestus combination, the red and blue stuff. Claudian will be the vessel for it, and he'll unwittingly resurrect her by bringing the blue crystal, with Athena in it maybe, to Lahabrea's soul that's trapped in Ascalon and Asisla since Heavensward. And the core themes of this raid will be resurrection, ascension, the dangers of playing God, the toll that ambition can take on family, and it'll also set some very interesting boundaries. Because given how classically moralistic the writers are with their approach to nihilism and positivity, I assume the takeaway will be that a soul cannot be created, at least not without sacrifice. As anyone who's watched Full Metal Alchemist will feel, playing God comes with a serious, serious price. That said, the emotionally satisfying ending, which the writers always do because they're so emotionally intelligent, they would be that they managed to make Erechthonius a real boy, but only because of the genuine love that Hephaestus had for Athena. That's trite, that's cliched, but we will all cry a little bit anyway. All of this in a raid. And in the same patch as the 6.2 MSQ, which was great as it is, God, we're eating so good. Anyway, this was a crazy long video, and I've been sick for the past few days, so excuse me if I sound in any way off. My throat and nose are absolutely destroyed. And I kind of wrote all of this in like a fervent fever while listening to Scream on repeat, sometimes Russian hard style. So I hope you enjoyed. I've got completely unhinged, and as always, I will see you again very soon, and I mean it this time because I won't get sick again and delay a video by a couple days. Sorry everyone, sorry John. Next one will be very, very soon indeed. So thank you very much, and I will see you very soon.